Greetings, everyone, and welcome to our ExchangeCon breakout session on troubleshooting hybrid deployments. We're very pleased to have eNow as a sponsor and presenter for this session of MS ExchangeCon 2014. My name is Roger. I'll be the event moderator, and as usual, I have a few quick housekeeping items before I introduce our speaker. We will be using the Twitter hashtag MS ExchangeCon to provide the links for the breakout sessions that will follow, so please join in that conversation. You may also use the chat panel during this broadcast to submit any questions or comments. We will address as many of those questions as possible at the end of the presentation, and we'll conclude in time for those of you who will be joining the next breakout session, which will begin approximately 5 minutes following the conclusion of this one. Our presenter for this session is Michael van Horenbeeck. Michael is a Microsoft Certified Solutions Master and Exchange Server MVP from Belgium, and he works for eNow, a market leader in monitoring and reporting software for Microsoft technologies. Michael specializes in Exchange, Office 365, Active Directory, and a bit of Link. He is an active contributor to the Exchange community by writing articles for several tech websites, his own blog, and by participating in the UC Architects webcast. And with that, Michael, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you.
Thanks, Roger. So thanks for having me. And as Roger already said today, we're going to talk about troubleshooting hybrid deployments. Now, interestingly enough, when we're talking about hybrid deployments and troubleshooting them, actually only 25% is about the Exchange architecture, and that's kind of the feel I want to give you for this presentation, that hybrid deployments, it's much more than only Exchange, and the troublemakers typically lie outside of Exchange. There's much more that comes into play. So before diving into the different components on how to troubleshoot several things that exist around hybrid deployments, I want to give you a little high-level overview on what that hybrid deployment is. And for some people that have seen my previous presentations, there might be some overlap, but it's really important to understand how the hybrid deployment, what it is, what the typical components are, how the architecture looks like, because in my opinion, the better you understand the technology and how things work together, the easier it is to troubleshoot things, and the more sense it will make when I'm talking about DirSync, when I'm talking about ADFS, and some of the key elements in each of these technologies. So first, let me start talking about what a hybrid deployment is. So on this slides, you will see that a hybrid deployment is a distinct cross-premises Exchange organization. So we have one organization on premises and one in the cloud, and we're combining them, and we're making some modifications to each of these environments to act together as a single organization. Now, these series of customizations, they typically happen through what we call the hybrid configuration wizard, right? And it's basically also the only way that you're allowed to do that and do it in a support way. Obviously, you could do some other things manually and get the same behavior, but still, assuming that a hybrid configuration wizard created your environment, all that you do is make some changes on premises, your send connectors, your receive connectors, and all that good stuff. And you typically do the same thing in Office 365. And as a result, both environments work seamlessly together from an end user perspective. So they won't see a difference or they shouldn't see a difference, whether they're on premises or in the cloud. Even when you move them, the entire user experience should actually be similar to what you have on premises and be fairly transparent. However, as an administrator, it doesn't change. It's still two environments that you need to manage. And as a result of that, because of there's two environments and two distinct environments, there are some things that never work. There are some things that or actually won't work today, might in the future. There are some things that might be causing issues, and there are some limitations that you need to take care of, some limitations that you need to keep in mind. So when we take a look at the architecture on the next slide, you will actually see that there's a lot of components that come into play. And this is only touching on the Exchange Online part. When you're really talking about a full hybrid deployment with Link and all that good stuff too, I mean, there's much more than that. But the Exchange components, if you break them down into smaller things, there's actually only 2 or 3 things that come into play. There's the Exchange Online protection part, which deals with the mail flow, inbound, outbound mail flow, cross-premises mail flow. And then we have the organizational relationships, or the inter-org connectors, using OAuth for free busy information. But all the other components, for instance, everything that has to do with authentication is more related to Azure AD, Active Directory, the synchronization between both, and all the components in between, which typically will include ADFS. Now, when I say typically include, I really mean that most of the companies that I've dealt with have been using ADFS in a hybrid deployment, small and large. I've seen small companies for 100 seats deploy ADFS because it does offer a really a competitive advantage over not having ADFS, and it's easier to deal with your end users from a password management point of view. Now, I have seen some companies make the switch from ADFS to password synchronization, which we will get to in just about a minute or two. But I mean, mostly you'll get in touch with ADFS. The problem I'm having with ADFS, though, is it is not easy, especially if you're not familiar with the technology. There's a lot of there's a steep learning curve that you have to go through before you grasp how ADFS works. And once you have that, and we'll go through some of the authentication flows later in this slide deck, there's still the troubleshooting part, and that doesn't get any easier. I mean, ADFS by itself isn't really easy to troubleshoot if there's an issue. But this time, you only have half of the story in hand. Instead of having two on-premises tools that you want to use ADFS with, you're having one component online which is managed by Microsoft, and there's no way that you're going to have access to the servers or the log files that Microsoft has. And then there's your end of the story, which is half of the view. So if there's ever a problem that you're having, you must rely on different third-party toolings, on diagnostic tools, which will help you figure out what the issue is. So it doesn't necessarily get any easier, but the more you do it, the more logic gets into the troubleshooting process, and the easier it actually becomes, without taking away too much from the slides that I'm going to talk about. So when we take a look at the different building blocks of a hybrid deployment, there's 4 areas where I typically focus on. There is Exchange Federation, which is responsible for free busy information, mail tips, cross-premises e-discovery, message tracking, and since recently there are now 2 ways of dealing with Exchange Federation. There is a traditional way, which uses the Microsoft Federation Gateway, and that's the way it has been since Exchange 2010. And we recently had the addition of OAuth, which is the future way of doing Exchange Federation. But that also means that depending on the environment that you work in, you could have one or the other to support, or even both. If you're running Exchange 2013-2010 in a mixed environment and you have set up OAuth, it's very well possible that some requests use OAuth and other requests use the Microsoft Federation Gateway and the organizational relationships. So keep that in mind as you're troubleshooting, because that, especially that typical scenario, doesn't make it any easier at all to troubleshoot the Federation information that you're going to exchange between on-premises and the cloud. So, I mean, it does provide some challenges. I'd even go as far as saying that right now, as of today, unless you want to do cross-premises e-discovery, there is no real need to be deploying OAuth. However, looking forward, it does make sense, and I typically take it up in a typical deployment to do OAuth as well. But let's keep that for when we talk about the troubleshooting part for Exchange Federation. Then there's DirSync. DirSync is actually the one that I like the most. It's a set and forget tool right now. You just install it, it works, and typically you don't have a lot of issues. However, seldom the issues come from technology. Issues come from mismanagement. Issues come from the human factor. And I don't mean that in a disrespectful way. I mean, in a large environment, there are a lot of people touching Active Directory, making changes, and sometimes you don't always have control over the changes that are being made. And that's what typically causes an issue in DirSync. So what I'm going to do later on in this slide deck is talk about some of the ways how you can use the DirSync management tools to kind of see what's happening under the hood and where you should find certain information if you're troubleshooting. Then there is the mail flow part, which is a critical component, especially if you have mailboxes on premises and in the cloud, which is highly visible too, depending on the failure that you're having. However, troubleshooting is it really depends on what the failure is in secure transport or in mail flow in general. But we'll dive into that later as well. And then mailbox moves is that could be a presentation on its own. I mean, they're pretty straightforward. They always work, or almost always work, but if they don't, you're really left, out in the cold trying to figure out what's causing the issues. And I'll briefly talk about some of the problems that I typically encounter on moving mailboxes. And one of them, for instance, is when you try moving a mailbox in Office 365, sometimes you come across the error message that it says, well, hey, I couldn't connect to the on-premises Exchange server. And in 6 out of 10 times, it's mostly certificate related. I've seen lots of different certificates issues, certificates expired. They, after all, didn't use the correct certificates. They've wrongfully configured their namespaces, basic stuff in general. But sometimes it goes much further than that, especially in larger environments where you have multiple internet-connected endpoints. Choosing the right endpoint can sometimes be difficult, or configuring that can sometimes be difficult too. And in this case, when troubleshooting your migration endpoint, which is your on-premises environment, because mailboxes aren't pushed to the cloud, mailboxes are pulled in through from Office 365 through your on-premises environment. There is that one particular command which I really love using. It's the test migration server availability command, which does an inbound test into your environment and which gives you all the diagnostic information. Now, again, diving into each of the error messages that you could get from that command, that would lead us way too far. The takeaway from that is, if you're ever running into connectivity issues while moving a mailbox, make sure that you use the test migration server command, and then you will get that information that you need, and from there on you can continue, because it could be a connectivity issue, it could be an authentication issue, it could be pretty much anything related to that. And then using that information, for instance, if you get a 401 and authenticated, you pretty much know it's related to the user account, and that's an entirely different troubleshooting flow that gets kicked off there. But at least, I mean, when I see issues, it's 9 times out of 10 related to that. So without stalling too much here on the mailbox moves, let's talk some common issues and common things that I see, and let's start with DirSync. As I said, it's a very robust tool, and typically it either synchronizes or it doesn't synchronize at all. It's fairly simple. I mean, it works or it doesn't work. If it doesn't work, well, there's a lot of work to do. It could be the server that's gone down. It could be the services that's down. At least it's straightforward. If it doesn't synchronize at all, there's an easy way, or there's always an easy way to get away with it. It's just to install a new DirSync appliance. I know, I'll probably be having some people frown at me and look at me and tell me, like, what is it that you're saying? Well, it all depends on how critical you consider DirSync to be. It is a piece of the infrastructure which can, be down for a few hours without causing too much issue. I'm not saying that, I'm not advocating or saying that it should, but at least, I mean, it's a less critical component in terms of that it has to be available all the time. That is, unless you're using password sync, because then it becomes quite critical, or at least highly visible if it goes down. Now, the fact that it's not synchronizing at all is rather easy to troubleshoot, because you just have to figure out, hey, why is it not synchronizing at all? And typically that would be an authentication issue. For instance, the DirSync account that's used has an expiring password, and if it expires and you didn't update it in DirSync, that could happen. If you have a connectivity issue. But the most problems I see, or the most difficult problems I see with DirSync, is that the DirSync appliance itself is doing what it should. It is trying to synchronize, but you get all sorts of different error messages in DirSync, like I couldn't synchronize the objects because there's already an object with the same attribute sets, and so forth and so on. And that's typically related to objects being duplicates, having illegal characters, and things like that. For instance, and I think that's the easiest way to describe this, you will definitely run into issues where you have a user account on premises and or a mailbox on premises and an AD contact where the AD contact has the same email address as the on-premises mailbox. If that happens and you try synchronizing both, you'll throw warnings or error messages in DirSync. One of them will be synchronized and the other one that is trying to get pushed into the cloud will not be able to override the first object because they don't match, right? And that'll get shown in the dashboard right away. But before diving into the user interface and actually showing how to deal with that, let's take a look at the next slide where I give you a high-level overview, about how DirSync works. And it's basically a two-step process. So the first step is pulling in the data from Active Directory into the metaverse. And then the second step is reading the objects from the metaverse into Office 365 and pushing them there. Now, you can see that I wrote Source AD Management Agent and a Target Web Service Management Agent. These are the old names for DirSync back in the days. Right? Today, they have a new name, and I'll get to them in the next screenshots. But the principle applies. So objects are being synchronized into the metaverse, and they are filtered the first time. Some objects are not being taken into account, and the same happens when you go to Office 365. Now, the metaverse is the temporary database where all the objects are being held in, all the attributes, so that subsequent synchronizations happen much faster, so that you can do delta synchronizations into Office 365. So the principle is fairly straightforward, fairly easy. The problem is that sometimes you get error messages and you need to find the object that you're talking about. So if your Active Directory has these duplicate contacts and Office 365 has one of the duplicate contacts because you're duplicate items, then obviously you need to figure out which one got synchronized and which one did not get synchronized, right? And the way that you do that is shown on the next page, where the DirSync appliance, if you open that appliance, or actually the tool, it's not an appliance, it's a software. So if you open the DirSync management tool, you will see something similar to this. So here you can see the different run profiles that have been configured to Office 365. Now, a run profile is one step in the process that I previously described. And what you see here, for instance, is an interface which is running fairly smoothly, lots of successes, but there's also some completed export errors or completed no objects or maybe warnings or general errors. And what you will see is in the marked areas, the errors in red, there will be the synchronization errors which will tell you, hey, these are the objects that have been causing issues that I could not synchronize to Office 365. The problem is that these objects that you will see there will have an object GUID. And now you need to figure out which object that actually belongs to. Well, luckily, the toolset that we have here has a lot of options or can help you to find that information. If you go to the metaverse search, on the next page, you will actually see that you can enter more information. So this screen kind of zooms in first into the different tabs. You have Operations Management Agents, Metaverse Designer, Metaverse Search. That's actually the ones that we're going to focus on. So if you click Metaverse Search, you get to the next screen. And it's there where you can actually search the temporary database, which I explained earlier, and you can search for a display name, or you can search for a source anchor. So typically, if there is an object GUID shown on the first page, in the red area that I mentioned earlier, that is going to be the source anchor of that object. You can use that information, and instead of searching for the attribute called display name, you can just as easily search for the source anchor, then type in the value or copy paste the value, and then search for that object. And what you will get is a list of results, which you see here on this screen. And by double-clicking the result that is being returned to you, you get to the details screen, and which is the next screen that you will see. And here in this screen, you can actually see more information about the objects. And this is how you can easily identify what on-premises object it is that you're talking about, because you'll see the SAM account name, the object type, and so further and so on. So typically, this is a process, a few steps that I go through every time that I need to troubleshoot and find out, okay, is there a duplicate object on premises? If so, what is the object? Where is the object on premises? And it's a fairly straightforward and easy way. However, However, it takes some time to get used to this this tool. So I suggest that you play around with it. Luckily, there's no easy way of deleting something in Dursing, so there's no delete button that you can kick it out of the metaverse. So it makes it a really safe way to gather information too. But it is pretty much, the best way to go ahead because there are no automated tools. Well, there are other tools like IDFix and so on, but they have a different purpose, at least a different purpose compared to this one. So again, the entire process might take you some time, but at least know where you can go ahead and have a look at that. Even more so, the more detailed approach for this on how to troubleshoot Dursing has been published on msexchange.org in a series of articles. So I really suggest take this information as a base point and have a read over there, which explains all the step-by-step on how to go through this entire process. So that is, from a high-level perspective, because we only have a limited amount of time, Dursing. Let's dive into Federation services. And that's when we run into issues. I mean, Federation services itself can be really cryptic, right? The error messages that you sometimes get are really helpful. And as I mentioned earlier, you only have half of the story. You have your infrastructure where you have access to, and then there's the Office 365 part, which is kind of obfuscated. So in order to troubleshoot what's going on, and I'm going to be brutally honest here, most of the time it's due to an on-premises failure. I think I still have to come across an issue that was caused by Office 365, though I'm not saying that it's not possible, though. But mostly it's related to on-premises, and you need to figure out, why is this happening? How is this happening? And more importantly, where is it failing? Is it failing internally? Is it failing externally? And the way that you can do that is, again, there are multiple approaches, but I always like to start with, enabling debug logging. By default, there is only so much that ADFS shows you. So on the next screen, you will see that enabling debug logging requires you to go into the event viewer, click on view, then click on the show analytic and debug logs, which will show a new folder called ADFS tracing, which has the ADFS debug log in it. And then, when you're reproducing an error message, you can enable the log, reproduce the issue, stop the log, and then go through each of the events without getting cluttered with too many events. Obviously, that is an approach which works really well if you can isolate an ADFS server to reproduce, or if you can be the only one trying to authenticate. But in a busy environment, that can sometimes be really downing to get all that information. So if you have that problem, then what you need is called the correlation ID, which is a sort of transaction ID, if you will. And then you have to search through the event logs for all the events related to that correlation ID. Now, luckily, everyone who has been working with the event logs knows that you can filter the event logs and use that information to your advantage. So this is, the best tip I can give you without going into third-party tools to troubleshoot ADFS. Now, the thing here is that it only gives you part of the information. Sometimes it's just not related to the ADFS server. It is something in between your client, on the network, maybe client-side related. And that's when third-party tools, more specifically, I like to use Fiddler, comes into play. So why would I use or recommend using Fiddler in these situations? Well, it is a tracing tool which can show you all the HTTP conversations that have been going on between you and the server. And there are some specific configurations that you have to do in Fiddler to make that work, but that's fairly straightforward. But it can tell you, okay, well, you tried hitting the login port in Office 365. You can see the redirect to the on-premises ADFS server. And then you can see where actually the request failed, which could be your ADFS proxy server if you're an external client, or if it's from internal that it fails, you're maybe hitting the ADFS server right away. At least it gives you that part of the information. The problem is that not many people are used to using Fiddler, and there is, a lack of a great book on how to use Fiddler. And again, it could take a few hours to explain it entirely how to troubleshoot that. A tip that I might give you there, it's a tip I've been using in the past as well, is there are some great resources by John Craddock, who's been speaking on TechEd on ADFS troubleshooting, and he goes through the process of using Fiddler. So I definitely recommend that you check that out. Now, why is Fiddler so important? That is something that will become clear on the next two slides. As I said earlier, there are two authentication flows, and I actually meant the next slide because I actually talked about this ADFS summary. So on the authentication flow page, which is the next page, yes, you will see that, or what you will see here is that it will actually, depict how the client transactions are going. So in the first step, the client is going to go to Exchange Online, and then when that happens, Exchange Online is triggering the client to present its credentials. So that's what happens now. Exchange Online sends the clients back, and then the client goes to the online authentication platform and says, hey, here are my credentials. So it'll present its credentials to Exchange Online, and then Exchange Online will see, hey, hold on for a second, you're a federated user. Okay, go back to your on-premises ADFS server. So that's what your user does. It goes to the ADFS server, and the ADFS server, in its turn, will then get to the domain controller, and then the domain controller will authenticate that user by taking a look at the username and password, and it will then send back information to the ADFS server. So once the DC authenticated, then it goes to the ADFS server. The ADFS server then crafts a token, says, okay, you're authenticated, that's great, here's the token, and the client takes that ADFS or that SAML token and presents it to Exchange Online or to the authentication platform, which will then validate the token because there is a trust between online and your on-premises environment, and it will change that logon token into an authentication token, and that authentication token is then presented by the client to the online platform. So this is the passive authentication flow because this is what a web client goes through if you're using SharePoint Online or if you're using Outlook Web App. This means that if you're troubleshooting this flow, Fiddler can be handy because it can tell you, hey, does it fail while you're trying to get to Exchange Online? Does it fail when you're trying to go to the authentication platform? Or does it fail when you're trying to talk to your ADFS server? That's when this tool is really helpful. However, consider the next slide. That's called the active authentication flow, for instance, when you're using Outlook. What happens when your client connects to Exchange Online, the first step is the same thing. Exchange Online tells your client, hey, I need your credentials. Your client presents the credentials, so you type in your username and password, send it along to Exchange. But because of the way that Outlook works, it wouldn't understand the redirect that it would normally get. So Exchange will actually go to the authentication platform for you, will try to authenticate, and from there on, what happens is pretty much the same thing, except it is not your user who is connecting to ADFS, it's actually Exchange Online or the authentication platform who is making an inbound connection to ADFS, who is going to present your credentials, who is then being authenticated, so the ADFS service goes to the DC replies back, the token is crafted, that token is then given back to the Exchange server, all within a matter of a few seconds, not even that. And then that token is sent to the authentication platform, being validated. There is a authentication token crafted, which then grants you access. Now, here's the thing. You can use Fiddler as much as you want to on your client. You will never see the conversation between Exchange Online and the ADFS server. That's when the debug logs come in handy, or that's when some tracing on the ADFS server would come in handy. So it's very important for you to understand when a certain flow is being used, because if a user is having authentication issues with Outlook, there's no use or there's no real need in using Fiddler because there's not much value to get out of that, right? So that's kind of the way I wanted to position this here, because I've seen, too many times, unfortunately, people go to Fiddler with the best intentions and then coming up empty-handed because, they didn't see the entire story, and that's what I meant with, only having half of the story available. So again, I mean, there's much more than this to the story, obviously, and I'm giving you the high-level overview, but hopefully you understand why troubleshooting ADFS can be daunting and why these use of third-party tools and the understanding of the authentication flow becomes very critical. Now, the last thing I wanted to talk to you about is Exchange Federation. Exchange Federation is, Exchange Federation actually is the part that takes care of FreeBSD information and some other things, but think FreeBSD for a moment with me because that's a commonly used feature in a hybrid deployment. Again, as I said, there are many things to look at: the organization relationships from on-premises to the cloud, or from the cloud to on-premises, the Federation Gateway Trust, some Federation information, some auto discovery information. But more importantly, it's very critical to understand how that all works. So if we take a look at the next slide, it all becomes clear to you where that comes into play. You see a lot of errors. So imagine there's a user on premises on the left-hand side called Lorian who makes a request for Michael's mailbox, Michael's availability. He sends that off to the Exchange server, and the Exchange server will actually try and do a lookup. Do I know Michael? And it will find a contact for Michael, but that actually says, hey, by the way, the target address for Michael is not on premises, it's in the cloud. So the very next step the Exchange server does is look up, hey, do I have an organizational relationship or an inter-organizational relationship with that environment? And it will find one, and this will actually instruct the Exchange server or tell the Exchange server, okay, there's the following flow I need to use. I go to the MFG, which is the Microsoft Federation Gateway. I get a token back. I then go to Office 365, use the token and the request to authenticate myself. Office 365 will accept the request and the token. First, validate the token as being valid, because the MFG will actually acknowledge that the token is valid. It will fetch the information and send it back. So there's a lot of going back and forth, all within a matter of a second or two. So this is pretty much transparent to the end user. But the thing here is that if you want to troubleshoot this, there is different ways to go about. And to get insight in this, the number one tip I can give you: use the test organization relationship command, because it will break down each of the steps that I just went through, and it will tell you, yes, I was able to do a test or get a token from the Microsoft Federation Gateway, so that's a pass. Then it will test the remote connectivity. It will tell you, yes, I was able to connect into the remote organization, that's a pass. And it will do that step by step and give you an overall pass or failure code, which you can then use and check, okay, it failed at the organizational relationship level. And then you can continue going from there and trying to figure out, okay, why did it fail? It could be an authentication issue, it could be a connectivity issue, but at least it gives you the insight that you need to find out where things went wrong. Now, again, there's a lot of things that you need to keep in mind here, because it could be that you couldn't find the contact, and that would surface there too. It could be a certificate issue. There's so many things that come into play, and the thing here is that troubleshooting hybrid deployments can be easy depending on the issue, but most of the time you're in the dark. You need to try and figure out what's happening there, and that kind of ties in with the last message I want to give to you is avoid troubleshooting if at all possible. Now, how do you avoid troubleshooting, especially in a hybrid deployment, right? Well, that's kind of what I want to talk about in the next slide here. Is monitoring for hybrid deployments. I know a lot of people use monitoring to avoid troubleshooting on premises, because they go out, they see when there is an issue, and they try and avoid issues, or try to be with the issues as soon as possible and get as much information for on-premises solution. It's an accepted practice for years and years and years, and everyone has monitoring on premises, and they should. However, when we get into the cloud world, people think it's less important because monitoring is done by Microsoft. And that is true. I'm pretty sure Microsoft is monitoring their servers. But they don't monitor your ADFS servers, nor do they monitor your DIRSync. They don't look at your certificates. You can only see that things don't work if any of these things aren't working. So, I mean, your Federation Trust might not be working due to a certificate issue, due to a connectivity issue. That won't affect how Microsoft looks at things. They look at their servers, and you shouldn't care about what's happening inside the data centers. I mean, that is really Microsoft's problem, and that is a big time saver. But now you need to worry about a lot of other things. DIRSync, identity federation stuff, exchange federation, certificates, connectivity, they all become even more important than they were before. And that's why there is really needs for components to be monitored. And one of the tools that I actually really suggest that you take a look at is Mailscape for Exchange Online, Mailscape 365. We do all of that. We take a look at directory synchronization. We take a look at identity federation. We do the synthetic transactions. We do the exchange federation part end-to-end, go to the machine, test that information, FreeBSD information and report on all of that. We go even as far as the mail flow tests, that we even test the hybrid deployment bits. We take a look at the authentication headers, and we take a look at the spam confidence level headers for cross-premises mail flow to make sure that all that is working, so you don't have to take care of all that troubleshooting, or you don't feel the pressure when there is an issue, because we will report it to you as soon as it happens. So I hope that you found this short overview helpful, and that gives you a little bit the idea of the issues that you might encounter and how to tackle most of them. But more importantly, make sure that you kind of understand what the architecture looks like, and also make sure that you do monitor your environment, because it is really critical important. You don't care as much about the server components, especially the Exchange servers, but you do care about all the rest, which might or might not be as much as Exchange as it used to be. So thanks for that.
So thank you, Michael, and I think we have time now to take a few questions, and we do have some questions coming in. Let me just dive right into those. First one is, what are some of the common DirSync issues that you see?
Well, as I said, mostly in DirSync, the problems I see there is objects not being synchronized because there are duplicates, especially the case I mentioned, user accounts existing or mailboxes existing, and then contacts in Active Directory, so no mail contacts but AD contacts being generated that have the same SMTP address. For instance, in a Lotus Notes to Exchange migration, this is something that might happen, and that's typically the case where I would see that. And then you get DirSync throwing a bunch of warnings at you. Sometimes they might impact, the user creation process, so that is something that you need to take a look at. But I mean, there are a lot of things that could happen in Active Directory, especially in larger environments, but that's pretty much the -- issue that I would see there, yeah. Or mismatching attributes, user principal names not being correct. That's all that stuff that that's quite common with DirSync.
Okay, here's a good question. What happens if DirSync is unavailable for a long period of time?
Oh, okay. So that is indeed a good question. As I said, it's not that critical. DirSync is used for provisioning, so creating user accounts, the ones that you create on premises that you automatically created in Office 365 too. And it is a critical component in that it allows for cross-premises mailbox moves, so it enables you to move mailboxes between environments, takes care of the attribute flow. So when DirSync goes down, new users that you create won't be created in Office 365. Mailboxes that you move won't get the updated attributes, and so forth and so on. So, I mean, as long as the environment stays untouched while DirSync is down, or there are no configuration changes or new users, you won't actually see a problem because things will just continue to work. But typically an environment is a moving target. There's a lot of changes going on, a lot of things that move back and forth, and that's why it's still important, but you could easily survive a few moments without DirSync.
Very good, and I think we have time for one more. I'm running a hybrid deployment. I'm running a hybrid deployment for migration purposes. Why would I care about free or busy information in a hybrid deployment?
Good question. Well, it all depends. If you're using the hybrid deployment just for moving mailboxes back and forth, then I'd say there's no problem. You don't care as much about FreeBSD. However, you are in a hybrid deployment, right? Which means that you're probably not able to do the one-off move of all your mailboxes. So during a certain time frame, you will have mailboxes in both environments that have to talk to each other and that actually need to be able to exchange FreeBSD information. So during that time, it is, I think, really important. It all comes down to your own expectations, of course. But once most of the mailboxes, like let's say 99% of the mailboxes are in the cloud, and the ones that remain on premises in the hybrid deployment are just mailboxes for mail flow or legacy applications, then it becomes less critical. Yes, and I agree. Then you would care less about that FreeBSD component.
Well, very good. That's all the time we have. We're going to wrap up in time to make sure that people who want to join the next breakout session will be able to do that. So at this point, on behalf of msexchange.org, I want to thank you, Michael, and all of our participants for joining us for this session. We, of course, want to thank eNow for helping us make it possible to bring you today's session. And we've got the information on screen right now for downloading a free trial of Mailscape for Exchange Online. Don't forget to join us at the next breakout session using the separate link for that session, which is available in your confirmation email, and we're also making it available at the Twitter hashtag MSExchangeCon. So again, thank you all for joining us, and you may now disconnect.